and it's good to be here. If you're new to C3, so am I. So, welcome. We had, if you don't know the structure of like a morning, at 9 o'clock, a few of us gather in a room over there and we discuss a question. Or today it was just a single word, and we have a very lively and generative conversation. And then we have our morning gathering, and then afterwards we have talk back, which means you get to talk back. And we get to have a little conversation post-service, post-teaching. And it's one of the things I really sort of love about this place. Each Sunday feels like an ongoing dialogue, and so it's life-giving to me. And one of the problems, though, with having a morning where you start off with a conversation, it tends to shape then what you're going to say. So, and I already have a problem not sticking to whatever I planned on talking about. A couple weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I think, I did a book reading for my new book at a bookstore in Grand Rapids, a Christian bookstore. And it was the first sort of Christian bookstore that I went to, and I thought, this will be interesting to see who comes, first of all. The subtitle of my book is Leaving Church, so I thought it'll be interesting to see who comes to a Christian bookstore to hear a reading. But it was a very generous crowd, and we had a good conversation. But one of the things that surprised me is I did like a typical reading, and then we did Q&A, and partway through, someone raised their hand, and this is what they said. They said, "What about the flood?" I thought, first of all, I don't have a chapter in my book about the flood, nor did I mention it, but that's what they wanted to know. I mean, I do have a chapter about the Bible in there, so I suppose I saw a connection, and so I said, well, what about it? And they wanted to know if I thought it was literal. So I said, no, I think it's a myth. I think it's a myth like the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, which has virtually the same story in it. But as I was saying it, I was trying to say that that doesn't mean it's not true, which is an odd thing to communicate, which is one of the problems with a word like myth. Michael Meade, the mythologist, I guess he would call himself, says, a myth is a series of lies that tell the truth. Right now we live in a culture with just a series of lies. But we kind of moved on in this conversation, and someone a few minutes later raised their hand and had another question about the flood. And I thought, what is going on? And afterwards, when people come up and talk to you, I had a third person, and that's what they wanted to talk about, the flood. It's like I should have wrote a book about the flood. But it stuck in my sort of thinking pattern over the next couple weeks, up until the present moment. Why were we talking about the flood? What's going on? And I kept turning that story over in my mind a few times. And first of all, I think there are some very obvious connections because we've been having massive floods. So it awakens something in us, probably in the deep structure of the psyche, in our own archetypal patterns, if you want to sound really fancy, that something in there knows of such a story where human beings in all our power and ability to control nature suddenly find ourselves in a moment where we have no control whatsoever. I mean, think about the tragedy and the power of saying an entire island is without power. Think about that as an image, as an idea. It awakens something, I think, deep. And some of it is just dread. There's a sense of dread. There's also a sense of awe and wonder. After all, storms are not new. Floods are not new. So I actually think that's probably why, although I'm not trying to psychoanalyze every person that raises their hand and has a question, but that's part of why I think this was coming up, this flood. And I also think we live in, if this is a phrase, I'm going to just use it, noadic times, where there seems to be a kind of flood, a tide is rising that has global implications that I think the original writers of the flood story or the Epic of Gilgamesh couldn't even imagine. When they imagined a worldwide catastrophe, they had a very small conception of what they meant by world. We have a different one. And I think, what do I mean by we live in Noah-like times? I don't mean God is up there and he's like getting ready to kill everybody. I mean, we live in an age where there are very few dreamers imagining a world that no one can yet conceive of. That's actually in the Noah story. Everybody thinks he's crazy. And he's building a boat for a flood no one has seen before. And they say, this guy's ridiculous. And Noah's an interesting figure because he doesn't have in mind just his own family's well-being, sort of like, I've got a bunker in the basement with bottled water and ammunition, and I'm going to survive. He actually has in mind every creature on the earth that he knows of. That's the whole 2x2 business. He's a dreamer in a time where the dreamers are having a hard time in this country. He's a dreamer, and it's such an interesting image. It's also an apocalyptic image. And I mean apocalypse in the old Greek sense of the word, which I don't mean Jesus flying down on a horse and sucking everyone up with a vacuum, not that kind of apocalypse. I mean it in the old sense that the world collapses and renews. Ancient people had an experience of such a thing, that the world collapses and yet it renews. I think we live in that age. Something of our world is collapsing. What it means to be an American is collapsing. It's coming to an end, which Yeats's poem is talking about. I mean, sorry I put that in there. Sorry to leave you with such a dark image. But there it is. And we need the poets. We need the poets because they tell a series of lies that tell the truth. and actually, poetry awakens in us the kind of soul knowledge that people are actually very hungry for. It's truth beyond facts. And we live in a crazy time where what we would call facts, I mean, it seems like you can just make them up. So we think it's in an argument about facts, and that's why you need poets, because they say, who cares about the facts? Let's talk about the fact that the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Now that is true. That's true. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. And here we are swinging out in these bigger circles, further and further away from home, whatever we mean by home. I mean home for the soul on the deeper level. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. That's true in the smallness of our little town, even our families, and very obviously on an economic, social, and political level. National level. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, where tweets about nuclear war and the NFL are on the same level. The blood-dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yeah, that seems true. That seems more true than fake news. So yeah, what is Yeats imagining? He's imagining the end of an era, the end of an age. He's wondering about the second coming, which is an apocalyptic image. The death of something and the renewal of something. Something in the ashes begins to grow out of the collapse of something old. That's the deep insight that our greatest storytellers and poets have always hovered around. It's actually the story right in the very heart of Christianity. What else is it except a story of the death of something and the renewal of something? It's right in the obvious thing that, wasn't there like a cross controversy at the musical Fountain, you know? I don't think they were had in mind what I'm talking about necessarily. These big archetypal patterns, but nevertheless, it's there. It's there. So yeah, the best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. So fairly dark, apocalyptic image that I think hooks us into the question of home, because there's a kind of homelessness. You can imagine it. Think about the falcon flying further and further away from the falconer, or you cannot hear even the falconer's voice anymore. You don't know where the center is. In other words, you don't know how to come back home. It's an image of someone, a human being, who's lost their own soul, their own center. And it's an image of a culture that's lost its own soul, its own center. It's lost the continuing cry of the falconer. Yeah, I don't want to explain too much. In fact, when I thought of this poem as I was preparing, obviously, since I put it in there. But I thought, I'm not going to read any criticism, like literary criticism, which ordinarily I like to do. I like to see what people say, all these things. Yeah, I was like, forget it. I'll just stick with the images as they are. I don't pretend to know what he's talking about. And I'm not pretending to know by reading someone else that's pretending to know, which we call scholarship. Quoting people, quoting people who quote people. That's what I call a PhD. And I'm wondering about this, and I'm going to come back to the Noah image. We need more dreamers, building a boat for a world that no one can yet imagine, who have in mind that the health of nature is directly related to the health of human beings. You can't have a world where you don't have the 2x2 animals side by side, 2x2 with human beings. That's a dreamer. We need more crazy people like this. Crazy Noah-like people. Like refugees in the world. Leaving one home for a kind of longing for another one. By the way, I just thought of this. In the Noah story, the apocalypse begins by saying that human beings are violent. I'm almost positive. I'll have to look that up. I don't have a Bible. Someone can do it on their phone. But in the opening, the opening image is that human beings are violent. There's so much violence. And then it says, and then God's going to, destroy the world by flood. And we can talk about what that means theologically, but I don't care about that right now. I'm just talking about, yeah, that seems true now. The world seems violent. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it begins by saying human beings were filled with greed. And the flood started rising. Yeah, so it seems to relate. That's why I wonder if we're in Noah-like times. And we need more people like Noah who start to follow this call for home, this pull. So I want to say a couple things about this pull of home. So what is this pull of home? The way I would describe it is that there's something of the soul's true place that is part of the call for home, the pull to home. Something of the soul's true place. What do I mean by that? I mean a place that one comes to occupy that feels like the place they were born to occupy. Have you heard that Buddhist phrase, the face you had before you were born? You've heard that phrase? Well, now you have. The face you had before you were born. Discovering the face you had before you were born. That's a little like what I'm talking about. You come to find something, the soul's place in the world, which, by the way, might mean you've lived in 19 different houses. That's part of the story. That's part of the wandering. As you begin to hunger and long, as Rilke says, go to the limits of your longing. And you're longing for that soul place in the world, that soul place that you inhabit, where your power, prestige, and possessions, the things that Americans worship, aren't at the center anymore. You've found what's underneath all that. That's the soul's place. What else would I say of this pull of home? It's a pull toward a world in which the soul can thrive. So not only, I think, are you and I individually and collectively searching for our soul's place in the world, but a world in which that soul can thrive. Because it might be the case that as you are following your golden threads to soul, you inhabit a world where it can't thrive. And we know many cultures and zip codes and islands where mere survival is what's called for. And it takes priority, as it should. But if some of those basic things were met, you could find a world in which the soul could thrive. Am I making sense? That's what I'm talking about, the pull of home. The pull of home. It's calling us. The falconer is calling out into the world back to this place where our soul inhabits a place that feels like home, and the world itself seems to support it. What else might I say of it? I think this pull of home also relates in this sense that we're imagining, dreaming of a world where something of the world comes to be where not only our soul can thrive, but the souls of other people can thrive. That's a kind of home worth dreaming about. So you have the inner stumbling toward one's own place. You have a world in which that soul can come to life, and you begin to look around and desire that for other people. Imagine a world where other people's souls can begin to thrive. Not to mention the soul of the world, which Yeats is hinting at in his poem. The soul of the world. I think the world does have a soul. I think the plants and animals, what we call nature, as if we're not nature, has a soul, has a place that it inhabits in the world. I have old trees on my property. I don't really own it. The bank owns it. And actually the bank doesn't really own it either. That's all fake. Fake news. I mean, you can't own a tree. It's silly. You can cut it down, but you can't own it. And one tree on my property, according to my farmer Bob, he's my neighbor, and he says it's 300 years old. I think he might be exaggerating by 100 years, but who knows? He knows more than I do about these things. And it's a black walnut tree. It has a massive lightning strike right down the center of it. And I have 2 elms on my property, both of which are still healthy, and they're at least very least 100 years old. So they were here before I was ever here, and they will see me enter the grave, most likely. Because if they can survive lightning strikes, imagine how old they can keep going. But what am I saying? I'm saying that something of those trees are inhabiting the place that they're meant to inhabit in the world. And they are a generative presence in their single place in the world in such a way that I can sit under their shade. And they become homes for all kinds of little critters and creatures, and particularly squirrels, who like who amass like hoarders little black walnuts to little piles around the trunk, and then eat them all winter. I mean, it's a whole universe unto itself. Yeats and also T.S. Eliot and a few others, they started writing these poems, these apocalyptic poems, because they were, with their poetic imagination, realizing what was going on in the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution had reduced the world to resources. And even when we have something terribly titled the Department of Natural Resources, as if wild lands are resources that are simply ours for the taking. That's a pretty limited view of the world. You probably all know this. I was just talking about with my friend Paul beforehand. It's just so interesting that native people who lived on this land had no concept that one could own land. That's such a... What do you mean you didn't have a concept? Conceptually, they had not formed the idea because it didn't make any sense to them. Because you can't own something that you're a part of. From dust you came, to dust you shall return. So, in terms of the dreams that we dream, the things that we imagine in our operative worldview, that's part of what is collapsing. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. We're coming to the limits of our own imagination. We're coming to the limits of our own dreams. We're coming to the limits of how we view the world. We're coming to the limits of what we mean by family. We're coming to the limits of what we mean by America. And the good news is, this is how the world is born again. It's through collapse. I wish it was some other way. I wish it was just through self-help books. 10 steps to make a better world. Step 1, let it fall apart. It just seems to be the way it is. I don't know if you're familiar with the scholar Phyllis Tickle. She died, I think, 2 years ago. Christian sort of historian, I would say. She came up with this lovely idea that she was speaking largely of Christianity, but I think she also meant the Western world in general, seems to have these 500-year cycles. And every 500 years, things go to hell, and they're sort of born anew. And the last one was called the Reformation. And that was 500 years ago. So we're right on schedule. And it's happening in all kinds of churches, all over the United States, all over Europe. Something is not holding. The center is not holding. It's unraveling and unwinding. And of course, in the middle of that, you have fights and circling the wagons and the drawing of weapons and anything to stem the rising flood. But she just seems to be saying there's a pattern here. There's some sort of archetypal pattern of apocalypse, of destruction and renewal. And we just happen to be in the midst of it. One of the things that attracted me to C3, by the way, coming here, was, and I might be making too much of this, I might not, I saw in your story something of what I'm trying to describe. Some kind of apocalyptic, I'm sure it felt that way to those of you who were around, some sort of apocalyptic destruction. And meanwhile, a few of you, a few dreamers, started patching together a little boat. And everyone around you, everyone meaning other churches, said, look at those crazy people. Look at those crazy people and their crazy values. Look at what they're doing. And yet a few of you started patching a little boat together. And it's still afloat. It just happens to be in this community center. And I always like being reminded, no alcohol beyond this point. Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I'm not trying to make you sound super special. I'm saying you fit the pattern well. And I also see it as a larger pattern that a lot of institutions and spiritual places are going through, a kind of upheaval. And to peel it back, part of that is because the falcon cannot hear the falconer. And the center, for whatever reason, is not holding. So Yeats's question is very straightforward, although it's a mythic kind of question. I'm trying to think of the line. What rough beast? What rough beast? Not what pretty savior, but what rough beast? Its hour come at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. That's the apocalypse of renewal. Some rough beast is slouching toward Bethlehem, waiting to be born. That is true, I think, on the personal level, and I also think it's true on a more social level. I don't know the character of this rough beast. We're in the midst of doing that kind of dive. Now, I want to say two quick things about the pull of home, about this apocalyptic renewal, and about the journey that I think many of us are on. Now, I probably already mentioned, and if not, you'll hear me start repeating myself soon enough. That's usually what speakers and preachers do, repeat themselves to death. So you'll hear some of the same patterns, but one of them has to do with Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero's journey. He popularized this a number of years ago with his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And what he essentially outlines is the very sort of quest for home that I'm hinting around about, that the world has gone mad, and a few people, like Noah, for example, set out. And they venture toward a world that they almost know nothing about. But they're willing to do such a thing only to eventually come back home again or find a new home of some sort. And with it, carry gifts that they received along the way from this descent. Because that's the sort of journey. From where you were or to a kind of descent into some darkness, like you think about the Odyssey, wandering around, and then returning to a kind of home. So he says this is a pattern that exists in the human soul and in all of our great stories. Or many of our great stories, I would say. But I wanted to mention something about it this morning because whenever we're in kind of apocalyptic times, the notion of the hero, that word is very charged, isn't it? I heard a general say on the radio last year, this is a general of the army, we need to stop using the word hero for every man or woman that goes off to war. He was feeling something about the tension around such a word. Because there are two kinds of hero journeys, and I'll try to describe them very briefly, and you'll get them right away. The first is what I call the adolescent Hollywood hero journey. What is it? It's about winning. It's about being victorious. It's about being number one. It's about going through hard times, but you knowing the way forward and going at all costs and saying, I know what I'm doing, follow me, I'll do it my way, and I'll save. Fill in the blank. That's the adolescent hero's journey. It's not what Joseph Campbell was talking about. Because what Joseph Campbell was talking about is that the hero or heroine sets off thinking they might know what they're doing, only to find out that everything they thought about the way the world works is going to stop working for them. And they fall apart. They're dismantled. Joseph Campbell says, they go out to slay the dragon and they get slayed. Do you feel the difference? Why? Because the adolescent hero that's all about winning and victory and thinks they know what they're doing, that's the very problem. And until that, to use fancy language, egoic persona dissolves, something of the soul on the deeper level can't be born. When the falcon cannot hear the falconer, it's because of the egoic persona. They can't hear that inner cry, which is over here, when things fall apart. That's why the great storytellers say things like apocalypse is a great gift to human beings. Because whatever illusions we thought we had get dissolved, dismantled, reworked so something new can be born. It's a much more humiliating kind of thing. You go out to save the world and you mess up. Now we're talking. Now we can start the kind of deeper journey that I think is needed. So, listen to what Joseph Campbell says about the quest. Destiny has summoned the hero or the heroine. Destiny. That's an old-fashioned word, but I like it. Destiny has summoned the hero or the heroine and transferred his or her spiritual center of gravity. Their spiritual center of gravity gets transferred from within the pale of society to a zone unknown. Now we're starting the real quest. The pale of society is, I know how things work. I know how to amass power. I know how to build a coalition. I know what values are the right values. That's the pale of society. I know how this thing works. When that gets transferred to a zone unknown, now we're talking. That means you're out wandering and you don't know where you're going, which is what the quest for home is really like. Out wandering. Which is why I think the Bible, by the way, really begins with the Abram story. It says, leave your country, your people, and your father's household. Now, you can't name 3 things that are closer to one's identity than country. Leave it. That means flag waving and, all that business. Country, your people. Wait, this is my people. I got my peeps with me. We, and your father or mother. Just means your household. If Abram doesn't leave those 3 things, there's no story. There's no thing we call the Bible. There's no thing we call the Jewish people. That's transferring one's zone of identity from the pale of society to a zone unknown. And Abram is told, go to a land I will show you, but he doesn't know anything about it, and he doesn't even know where it is. Do you hear what I'm saying? So, in the old world of giving sermons, you're supposed to do things like, how are you going to apply this to your life? I have no freaking idea. You can't go and apply an apocalypse to your life. It's just happening. What I'm saying is if you feel like a wanderer and you're feeling like your own soul is longing for a place, I say welcome. If you feel like our society is absolutely gone mad, you're right. And something may be collapsing, and it might have to get a whole lot worse before it gets any better. Because that seems to be the pattern for such a thing. What I'm saying is that if you are a boat builder and something of your own soul is starting to wake up, you're not a crazy person to me. To everyone else, fine. But to me, it's not such a crazy notion. I want to end with one idea. And it's an old idea. And the idea is this. Maybe you've heard it. The idea is that the soul, and you might want to ask me sometime, what do you mean by the soul? And I'm going to say, I'm not really sure. The soul chooses the time in which it's to be born. It's an old idea. The soul chooses the time into which it is born. When I was a kid, I wanted to live in the 1800s. I did. I wanted to wear a coonskin cap, and I wanted to have a muzzle loader, and I grew up in Virginia in the mountains, and I wanted to run around and befriend. We called them Indians back then. That's what I wanted to do. I felt like I was born in the wrong era. This little insight says, there's no such thing. You were born for such a time as this. Something about me trusts that idea. And to go back to the poem, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. If you are feeling like you lack some conviction, I just want to end by saying, maybe it's the case that your soul has chosen to be born in this freaking crazy time, in these 4 years. And you know what I'm referring to. Right now. I don't know why, but something of your own soul's gift in the world is needed right now, in the middle of the apocalypse. That's what I'm trying to say. So keep going. Thank you.